San Simeon, California. A castle perched on a hillside overlooking the Pacific Ocean, filled with treasures from around the world. 8 homes, the largest private zoo in America, parties with Hollywood's biggest stars. At the center of it all, a man who controlled what millions of Americans read every single morning. This was the empire of William Randolph Hearst, a fortune that seemed impossible to lose. Then came the 1930s. Then came debt. Then came a scandal so shocking it would define how America saw the family name for generations. This is the story of how one of the most powerful families in American history lost it all. The man who invented yellow journalism. William Randolph Hearst was born on April 29, 1863, in San Francisco. He was the only child of George Hearst, a gold miner who struck it rich during the California Gold Rush, and Phoebe Apperson Hearst, a former schoolteacher from Missouri. George Hearst didn't just find gold, he became one of the shrewdest mining investors in America, expanding into silver, copper, and vast ranching operations. He bought 40,000 acres at San Simeon in 1865, land his son would later transform into a monument to excess. Young William grew up surrounded by wealth and privilege. His mother took him on art tours across Europe before he turned 16. He attended the best private schools, then enrolled at Harvard. But Harvard didn't last long. Hearst was expelled after 2 years for what the university called misconduct. The stories vary, but one popular account claims he sent personalized chamber pots to his professors, complete with their names inscribed on the inside. Whether true or embellished, it captured something essential about William Randolph Hearst. He respected nothing and no one. In 1887, at age 24, Hearst took control of the San Francisco Examiner, a failing newspaper his father had acquired as payment for a gambling debt. George Hearst had no interest in running a newspaper. He'd bought it purely to help his political career. When his son demanded to run it, George reluctantly agreed, probably expecting the spoiled young man to fail. Hearst didn't fail. He transformed the Examiner into something the world had never quite seen before. He hired the best writers money could buy, including Mark Twain, Ambrose Bierce, and Jack London. He bought the most advanced printing equipment. He ran sensational stories about crime, corruption, and scandal. He made up stories when real ones weren't exciting enough. He called his paper the monarch of the dailies, and within a few years, it dominated San Francisco. What Hearst pioneered would later be called yellow journalism, named after a comic strip character called the Yellow Kid. It was sensationalism, exaggeration, and outright fabrication packaged as news. It was also extraordinarily profitable. In 1895, with financial backing from his mother, Hearst bought the struggling New York Morning Journal. He immediately went to war with Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, the most successful paper in the city. Hearst raided Pulitzer's staff, offering writers and cartoonists higher salaries and better positions. He slashed the journal's price to 1 cent. He filled the pages with lurid crime stories, sensational headlines, and illustrations. Within a year, the journal's circulation tripled. The battle between Hearst and Pulitzer became legendary. Both men pushed journalism to new extremes, each trying to outdo the other in sensation and scandal. But Hearst didn't just sell newspapers, he used them as weapons. In the late 1890s, tensions rose between the United States and Spain over Cuba. Hearst's newspapers didn't just report on these tensions, they manufactured them. His reporters filed exaggerated and sometimes completely fabricated stories about Spanish atrocities. His papers ran inflammatory headlines demanding war. Hearst himself allegedly sent a telegram to a photographer in Cuba who complained nothing was happening there. The exact wording is disputed, but the message was clear. You provide the pictures, Hearst would provide the war. When the Spanish-American War finally erupted in 1898, Hearst took credit. One famous headline in his papers read, "How do you like the Journal's war?" Through dishonest and exaggerated reporting, Hearst's newspapers had actually helped cause a war between two nations. The man had discovered something terrifying and intoxicating. Control the news, control the nation. By 1925, Hearst owned newspapers in every major section of the United States. The San Francisco Examiner, the New York Journal, the Chicago American, the Boston American, the Los Angeles Examiner. He controlled 28 major newspapers and 18 magazines, including Cosmopolitan, Good Housekeeping, Town and Country, and Harper's Bazaar. He owned radio stations, news services, film production companies, and even created King Features Syndicate, which became the largest distributor of comic strips and text features in the world. At the empire's peak in the mid-1930s, Hearst's publications reached 20 million readers every single day. 1 in 4 Americans got their news from a Hearst paper. If William Randolph Hearst said something was true, millions believed it. But the newspaper empire was just the beginning of what Hearst was building: the castle, the mistress, and the spending that never stopped. In 1903, Hearst married Millicent Wilson, a chorus girl he'd been courting since she was 16. She was nearly 20 years younger than him. They had 5 sons together between 1904 and 1915. George, William Randolph Jr., John, and twins Randolph and David. Millicent settled into life as Mrs. Hearst in New York, raising their children, hosting society events, running charitable foundations. But Hearst himself was rarely in New York. By 1917, he had begun an affair with Marion Davies, a beautiful 19-year-old actress and comedian performing in the Ziegfeld Follies. Hearst was 53 years old. The relationship became Hollywood's worst-kept secret. Hearst never divorced Millicent because of his Catholic faith, but he lived openly with Marion Davies in California. He showered her with gifts, started a production company specifically to make movies starring her, and used his newspapers to promote her films relentlessly. In the 1920s, Hearst decided to build something that would cement his legacy forever. On the 250,000-acre San Simeon estate he'd inherited from his parents, he commissioned architect Julia Morgan to design a castle. Not a large house, a castle. Construction began in 1922 and continued for decades. The main building, Casa Grande, rose with twin towers visible for miles. 3 guest houses surrounded it. There were 56 bedrooms, 61 bathrooms, 19 sitting rooms, indoor and outdoor pools covered in elaborate tile work imported from Europe, tennis courts, a movie theatre. Hearst filled the castle with art and antiques he bought obsessively from Europe: medieval tapestries, Renaissance paintings, Egyptian statues. Entire rooms were purchased from European castles and palaces, disassembled, shipped to California, and rebuilt. At one point in the 1920s, Hearst accounted for 25% of the world's art market. He had the largest private zoo in America, with kangaroos, camels, zebras, ostriches, emus, elephants, and bears roaming the grounds. First-time guests driving up the winding road to the castle would see exotic animals wandering freely and wonder if they were hallucinating. San Simeon became a playground for Hollywood's elite. Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, Greta Garbo, Clark Gable, Cary Grant all came to weekend parties at Hearst Castle. The dinners were legendary. The parties lasted days. Marion Davies hosted alongside Hearst, playing the role of Lady of the Manor, while Millicent remained in New York, legally married but effectively abandoned. The problem was money, or rather, the lack of money management. Hearst spent as if his wealth was infinite. His annual personal expenses in the 1920s exceeded $15 million, equivalent to roughly $200 million today. He bought entire castles in Europe. He owned 8 fully furnished homes scattered across the country. He purchased art compulsively, obsessively, even when he already owned similar pieces. He stored thousands of items in warehouses because his homes couldn't hold them all. The newspapers, for all their circulation, had never really paid their own way. The real money had always come from mining, ranching, and forestry. But Hearst treated his empire as a piggy bank, constantly borrowing against future earnings to fund his current extravagances. By the late 1920s, financial advisors were warning him about debt. Hearst ignored them. He always had. Why would he stop now? Then 1929 arrived, and with it, the Great Depression. The empire crumbles. The stock market crashed in October 1929, plunging America into the worst economic depression in history. Advertising revenues collapsed. Businesses that had paid thousands of dollars for newspaper ads suddenly couldn't afford hundreds. Circulation started dropping as unemployed workers couldn't spare even a penny for a paper. The Hearst Corporation, which had seemed invincible just years before, suddenly looked very vulnerable and exposed. Hearst's initial response was to support Franklin Roosevelt's election in 1932. His newspapers backed the New Deal. He met with Roosevelt, advised him, and used his media empire to promote the president's programs. But the relationship soured quickly. Roosevelt's policies included progressive taxation, strong labor unions, and government regulation of business. For a man as wealthy as Hearst, these were threats. By 1934, Hearst had turned completely against Roosevelt. His newspapers attacked the New Deal as communist. He called Roosevelt's graduated income tax a Marxist policy designed to destroy the wealthy. His editorials became increasingly hysterical, comparing Roosevelt to Stalin and claiming the government was infiltrated by communists. In September 1936, his papers published editorials calling Roosevelt a socialist, a communist, and a Bolshevik, all in the same breath. Hearst's readers, however, were largely working-class people who loved Roosevelt. They saw the New Deal as their salvation. When Hearst attacked their president, they stopped buying Hearst papers. Circulation plummeted. Advertising dried up further. The financial crisis accelerated. Making matters worse, Hearst's politics became increasingly toxic. In 1934, he travelled to Germany and interviewed Adolf Hitler. The interview ran in his papers, helping legitimize Hitler at a time when most Americans didn't understand the Nazi threat. Hearst even published articles written by leading Nazis. His papers ran favourable coverage of Nazi Germany until 1938. When he finally turned against Hitler, it was too late. His reputation had been damaged. By 1937, the Hearst Corporation was drowning in debt. The exact amount is disputed, but estimates range from $110 million to $126 million, equivalent to roughly $1.5 billion to $2 billion today. Hearst owed $78 million to banks and creditors. He owed $9 million to paper suppliers alone. His corporations couldn't pay the interest on the loans, much less reduce the principal. He was functionally bankrupt, unable to meet even basic obligations without selling assets. Banks refused to lend him more money. Investors wouldn't buy bonds from his corporations. In 1937, Hearst faced a court-mandated reorganization. A committee of 7 men, mostly bankers and corporate executives, took control of the empire. William Randolph Hearst, the man who had built the largest media empire in American history, was reduced to being an employee. He still had the title of publisher, but he no longer controlled his own company. Others made the decisions. Others decided which papers to close and which to keep. The humiliation was total. Hearst had to sell properties. Newspapers in Chicago and Los Angeles were shuttered or sold. Radio stations went on the market. The film production company closed. And then came the truly painful part. The art collection had to go. In 1939, Hearst began selling pieces from his vast collection. Paintings by Van Dyck, furniture owned by George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, medieval armour, tapestries, chalices. In 1941, Gimbel's department store in New York held what newspapers called a fire sale. Thousands of items from Hearst's collection were sold at a fraction of what he'd paid. Marion Davies, who truly loved him, sold her jewellery and stocks to loan him $1 million. Even that wasn't enough. Hearst had to pay rent to live in his own castle. San Simeon had been mortgaged to Los Angeles Times owner Harry Chandler back in 1933 for $600,000. Now, the man who had spent decades building a monument to his power and taste couldn't even afford to maintain it. By 1940, Hearst had lost personal control of his empire. The 28 newspapers were down to 8. The magazines remained, barely. World War II eventually revived advertising revenues and stabilised what remained of the corporation, but Hearst himself would never recover the power he'd once held. The man who had made presidents and started wars had been brought low by his own inability to stop spending, and the family he'd leave behind would inherit not just wealth, but a curse that came with the name: the kidnapping that shocked America. William Randolph Hearst died on August 14, 1951, in Beverly Hills. He was 88 years old. In 1947, his failing health had forced him to leave San Simeon for the last time. He moved to Marion Davies's Beverly Hills home to be near doctors. When they left the castle, Davies saw tears streaming down the old man's face. She promised they'd return. They never did. Hearst's will was extraordinary in its complexity and its distrust. He left 99% of the Hearst Corporation's common stock to 2 charitable trusts he'd established, the Hearst Foundation and the William Randolph Hearst Foundation. His 5 sons would receive income from the estate, but they wouldn't control the business. That power went to a board of 13 trustees, 8 of whom were non-family corporate executives. Hearst had seen what he was like with unlimited power and unlimited money. He apparently didn't trust his sons to be any better. The will also included what's called an interim clause. Any heir who challenged the structure of the estate or questioned the trustees' decisions would be immediately disinherited. The family could receive money, but they couldn't ask questions about how that money was being managed or what was happening to the business that bore their name. They were locked out of their own castle, as one attorney later put it. The sons went into the family business anyway. William Randolph Jr. became a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist for Hearst newspapers. Randolph took over management positions. They worked to rehabilitate the Hearst name, to shed the yellow journalism reputation their father had earned, to build credibility. None of them graduated from college, following their father's example. None of them achieved anything close to their father's power. Randolph Hearst had 5 daughters with his wife, Catherine Campbell. The 3rd daughter, born on February 20th, 1954, was named Patricia Campbell Hearst. They called her Patty. She grew up in Hillsborough, California, in comfortable wealth. She attended private schools. She was shy, privileged, protected. In 1974, she was a 19-year-old sophomore at the University of California, Berkeley, living with her fiancé, Stephen Weed. She was planning her wedding, picking out china patterns, living the life of a young heiress. On the night of February 4th, 1974, there was a knock on the door of her Berkeley apartment. When the door opened, armed men and women burst in. They beat Stephen Weed with a rifle butt. They dragged Patty Hearst, screaming, to a waiting car. Neighbours who came outside to help were driven back by gunfire. Patty was thrown into the trunk and driven away into the night. 3 days later, a group calling itself the Symbionese Liberation Army claimed responsibility. The SLA was a tiny band of radical revolutionaries, probably never more than a dozen members. They were led by Donald DeFreeze, an escaped convict who called himself General Field Marshal Cinque. Their ideology was confused and incoherent, a mix of revolutionary leftism, racial politics, and pure anarchism. Their motto was "Death to the fascist insect that preys upon the life of the people." The SLA's first major action had been assassinating Marcus Foster, the black superintendent of Oakland schools, in November 1973. They'd killed him because they mistakenly believed he supported requiring student ID cards, which they saw as fascist. The murder had alienated other radical groups and accomplished nothing. The kidnapping of Patty Hearst was meant to be their big statement, the action that would finally get America's attention. It worked. The kidnapping became national news immediately. The granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, the heiress to one of America's great fortunes, taken by armed revolutionaries. The media camped outside Randolph Hearst's Hillsborough mansion. Every development made headlines. The SLA understood they'd captured the perfect victim. Their demands were extraordinary. First, they wanted 2 imprisoned SLA members released. When that was denied, they demanded that the Hearst family distribute $70 worth of food to every needy person in California. The cost would have been roughly $400 million. Randolph Hearst, desperate to get his daughter back, arranged for a $2 million food distribution program called People in Need. The distribution descended into chaos with long lines, shortages, and complaints about the quality of food. The SLA called it inadequate and refused to release Patty. Meanwhile, inside a closet in a small apartment, Patty Hearst was being broken. For weeks, she was kept blindfolded and bound, let out only for meals. DeFreeze repeatedly threatened to execute her. She was assaulted, traumatized, and told constantly that her family had abandoned her. She was given SLA political tracts to memorize and told to think about whether she wanted to die or join the revolution. After about 2 months, something changed. On April 3, 1974, the SLA released a tape recording. Patty Hearst's voice announced that she had joined the Symbionese Liberation Army. She had taken the revolutionary name Tanya after Che Guevara's companion. She denounced her family as pigs and declared her commitment to the revolution. 12 days later, on April 15th, security cameras at the Hibernia Bank in San Francisco captured images that would shock America. Patty Hearst, dressed in dark clothing and a wig, stood in the bank holding a rifle. She barked orders at customers, telling them to get down. She provided cover for other SLA members as they robbed the bank of $10,000. The photographs were published in every newspaper in America. The heiress had become a revolutionary. The question that would haunt the case for decades was simple but unanswerable. Had Patty Hearst been brainwashed, or had she willingly joined her captors? The SLA claimed she was a true believer. Her family insisted she'd been coerced. The truth was probably somewhere in between, in a psychological space that most people never have to inhabit. In May 1974, 3 months after the kidnapping, Los Angeles police tracked 6 SLA members to a house in Compton. A massive shootout followed, broadcast live on television. The house burned. 6 SLA members died, including Donald DeFreeze. But Patty Hearst wasn't inside. She, along with Bill and Emily Harris, 2 SLA members, watched the shootout on TV from a motel room. They remained fugitives for another 16 months. During that time, Patty participated in at least one more robbery, driving the getaway car for a Crocker Bank robbery in Carmichael in April 1975. During that robbery, Emily Harris shot and killed a bystander named Myrna Opsahl. The violence had become real and deadly, and Patty was part of it. On September 18, 1975, the FBI finally caught up with the fugitives in San Francisco. Patty Hearst was arrested along with another SLA member, Wendy Yoshimura. When asked her occupation during booking, Patty famously replied, "Urban guerrilla, trial, prison, and the question." No one could answer. The trial of Patty Hearst became one of the most sensational legal proceedings in American history. Her defense attorney was F. Lee Bailey, one of the most famous lawyers in America. His strategy was to argue that Patty had been brainwashed. Expert witnesses testified about coercive persuasion, about how prolonged isolation, threats, and abuse could break a person's will. One psychiatrist called her a classic case that met all the psychological criteria of a coerced prisoner of war. The prosecution argued the opposite. They pointed to evidence that Patty had opportunities to escape but didn't take them. In May 1974, she'd been left alone in a van with the keys in the ignition while Bill and Emily Harris shoplifted from a sporting goods store. When the Harrises were caught, Patty didn't drive away. Instead, she picked up a machine gun and fired wildly across the street to help them escape. She fired 2 separate bursts of gunfire, miraculously hitting no one, successfully freeing the Harrises. Was that the action of a captive looking for escape, or a willing participant? The jury didn't believe the brainwashing defense. On March 20th, 1976, Patty Hearst was convicted of bank robbery and using a firearm during a felony. She was sentenced to 35 years in prison, later reduced to 7 years. She was 22 years old, the granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, raised in privilege and wealth, would spend her 20s in federal prison. Patty served nearly 2 years. In February 1979, President Jimmy Carter commuted her sentence. Carter believed she'd been treated harshly, that the circumstances of her case warranted mercy. She was released on February 1st, 1979, under probation conditions. 2 months later, she married Bernard Shaw, a police officer who had been part of her security detail during the trial. They moved to Connecticut and started a family, having 2 daughters. For years, Patty tried to move on. She published a memoir in 1981 called Every Secret Thing, detailing her kidnapping and captivity. She became involved in charitable work, particularly a foundation helping children with AIDS. She stayed out of trouble, lived quietly, raised her family, but the conviction remained on her record. In 1987, she filed a petition asking President Ronald Reagan for a pardon. Reagan had publicly supported her when he was governor of California, calling her a victim of terrorism. But Reagan left office in 1988 without granting the pardon. George H.W. Bush also declined to pardon her. It wasn't until January 20th, 2001, President Bill Clinton's last day in office, that Patty Hearst finally received a presidential pardon. She was one of 140 controversial pardons Clinton issued as he left office, a list that also included fugitive financier Mark Rich. Patty became the first person in American history to receive both a commutation from one president and a pardon from another. Some saw it as justice for a victim of terrorism. Others saw it as pure privilege, the Hearst name, and wealth buying forgiveness that an ordinary person would never receive. The Patty Hearst case exposed something uncomfortable about the Hearst family legacy. For generations, the name had meant power, influence, the ability to shape what Americans believed. But that power cut both ways. The SLA had chosen Patty specifically because of her name. The media coverage was so intense because of her name. The trial became such a spectacle because of her name. And ultimately, the pardon came, at least in part, because of her name. The empire William Randolph Hearst had built carried with it a visibility and vulnerability that money couldn't protect against. The same name that had opened every door had also painted a target on a young woman's back. What remains? Today, the Hearst Corporation still exists. It's one of the largest privately held media companies in America, with interests in magazines, newspapers, broadcasting, and digital media. The family still owns it, though control remains with a board of trustees, not with the heirs themselves. The direct descendants receive income from the estate, millions of dollars a year, but they don't run the company. The structure William Randolph Hearst created in his will remains in force. Patricia Hearst Shaw lives quietly in Connecticut. She appeared in several John Waters films in the 1990s, playing small roles with a sense of humour about her past. She's been married to Bernard Shaw for over 40 years. She raised 2 daughters who grew up far from the spotlight. She doesn't give many interviews. When she does, she prefers to be called Patricia, not Patty. She wants to be seen as something other than the 19-year-old kidnapping victim or the 22-year-old bank robber. The Hearst Castle at San Simeon is now a state park and museum. It's one of California's major tourist attractions, drawing nearly 1 million visitors a year. They walk through the opulent rooms, marvel at the Neptune pool with its marble colonnades and statuary, tour the art collections. They learn about William Randolph Hearst's life, his ambition, his success, his eventual downfall. The castle stands as a monument to what American capitalism could build in its most uninhibited form. But it also stands as a warning about what happens when wealth becomes untethered from restraint, when power isn't accompanied by wisdom, when spending continues long after the income stops. William Randolph Hearst built the largest media empire in American history and then lost control of it because he couldn't stop spending. He created a dynasty and then structured it so his own sons couldn't fully inherit what he'd built. He made the family name famous and infamous in equal measure. The tragedy of the Hearst family isn't just about lost wealth or a kidnapping or a trial. It's about how a name can become a burden, how visibility can become vulnerability, how the same qualities that build an empire can also destroy it. William Randolph Hearst was ambitious, audacious, willing to break every rule to get what he wanted. Those qualities made him one of the most powerful men in America. They also made him reckless, excessive, blind to consequences. His granddaughter Patty inherited the name, the wealth, and ultimately the consequences of being a Hearst in America. The kidnapping, the trial, the decades spent living under the shadow of those 19 months in 1974 and 1975. All of it flowed from the decisions made by a man who died 3 years before she was born. None of William Randolph Hearst's 5 sons ever matched their father's achievements or his infamy. The third generation largely avoided the spotlight. The fortune remains, managed by others, generating income, but not the kind of power the name once commanded. The Hearst Corporation will probably continue for decades more, publishing magazines, running media properties, quietly perpetuating itself. But the age of Hearst dominance ended in the 1930s when the bills came due and the empire had to be saved from its own founder. What remains is a name that means different things to different generations. To some, it means Citizen Kane, Orson Welles' masterpiece about the rise and fall of a media tycoon. To others, it means yellow journalism and the Spanish-American War. To still others, it means a young woman with a rifle in a bank, one of the most disturbing and confusing images of the 1970s. The castle on the hill attracts tourists who want to see how the extremely wealthy once lived. The magazines carry the name on their mastheads. The fortune persists, but the power is gone, dissipated across generations, divided among heirs who receive checks but not control, spread too thin to be wielded the way William Randolph Hearst once wielded it. The downfall wasn't sudden. It took years, decades even. But it was inevitable from the moment Hearst decided that his appetites mattered more than his balance sheet, that his desires were more important than sustainability. He built an empire and then consumed it, leaving his descendants with wealth but not dominion, money but not power, a name that opened doors but also invited scrutiny, judgment, and sometimes violence. The Hearst family story is American capitalism, writ large and then brought low. It's the dream of unlimited growth meeting the reality of limited resources. It's the fantasy that wealth guarantees security colliding with the truth that visibility creates vulnerability. It's 3 generations of decline following 1 generation of dominance, the natural order reasserting itself after one man briefly bent it to his will. The castle still stands on the hill at San Simeon, testament to what was built and what was lost. Visitors tour it every day, walking through rooms once filled with Hollywood's elite, looking at art that survived only because creditors demanded it be sold. They see the legacy of William Randolph Hearst frozen in time, preserved as a museum piece, beautiful and tragic and utterly finite. And somewhere in Connecticut, his granddaughter lives quietly, carrying a name that defined her life in ways she never chose, in ways her grandfather never imagined when he was building his empire and chasing his ambitions and believing that nothing could ever stop him. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. Monaco sparkles on the Mediterranean coast. Yachts worth more than most people will earn in 10 lifetimes crowd the harbour. The casinos never close. The royal palace overlooks it all from the Rock of Monaco, home to Europe's longest ruling family. But beneath the glamour, the House of Grimaldi has endured heartbreak that money cannot heal. Marriages that crumbled, lives lost too soon, and a legend that has followed them for 700 years. A curse born from violence. The story begins in 1297 when Francesco Grimaldi and his brother captured Monaco disguised as monks. They took control of the fortress and established a dynasty that would rule for 8 centuries. But the Grimaldis didn't just conquer Monaco through disguise and strategy. They held power through force. According to legend, Prince Rainier I of Monaco became Admiral of France in 1304 after winning the Battle of Zierikzee. To celebrate his naval victory against the Flemish fleet, the prince kidnapped a beautiful Flemish woman. What happened next depends on which version of the story you believe. Some say he forced himself upon her, and in her rage, she cursed him and all his descendants. She declared that never would a Grimaldi find happiness in marriage. Another version claims a witch placed the curse. Prince Rainier had ordered her burned at the stake, and as the flames consumed her, she condemned the entire bloodline to misery in love. Whether the woman was a maiden seeking revenge or a witch facing execution, the words were the same. The Grimaldi family would know wealth and power, but their marriages would always end in sorrow. For centuries, few outside Monaco paid much attention to this legend. It seemed like just another royal family story, the kind passed down through generations without much thought to whether it was actually true. But in the 20th century, the tragedies became impossible to ignore. The American princess who changed everything. Grace Kelly stood at the height of Hollywood stardom in 1955. She'd won an Academy Award for The Country Girl. Alfred Hitchcock had made her the icy blonde star of Rear Window and To Catch a Thief. She dated some of the most famous men in the world. At 26, she seemed to have everything. Then she met Prince Rainier III of Monaco at the Cannes Film Festival. He was a bachelor prince ruling the smallest country in Europe, except for Vatican City. Their courtship lasted 7 months. In April 1956, Grace Kelly became Princess Grace of Monaco in a wedding that captivated the world. The Hollywood actress who played roles in fairy tale romances was now living one. Grace gave up her film career to become a princess. She and Rainier had 3 children. Caroline arrived in 1957, Albert in 1958, and Stephanie in 1965. The family appeared picture perfect. Monaco transformed from a sleepy principality into a playground for the world's wealthy elite. Grace became an icon of elegance and sophistication. She threw herself into charity work, establishing the Princess Grace Foundation to support local artisans in 1964. She created Aide Mondiale, an organisation for children's rights that gained consultative status with UNICEF and UNESCO. But the fairy tale had cracks that the public didn't see. Grace reportedly struggled with the transition from Hollywood to royal life. She found Monaco isolating and missed acting desperately. The principality felt like a gilded cage after the freedom and excitement of Hollywood. There were persistent rumours that Rainier had mistresses, though nothing was ever proven. Grace was said to have maintained close friendships with former co-stars that raised eyebrows. The press speculated endlessly about the state of their marriage. Grace wanted to return to acting in the late 1970s and considered several film offers, but Rainier reportedly opposed the idea. She was a princess now, not an actress, and he expected her to focus on royal duties. By the summer of 1982, Grace was 52 years old. She hadn't felt well for weeks. Her family later said she'd been experiencing headaches and seemed tired. Some claimed she was going through menopause and dealing with high blood pressure, though doctors would later deny the blood pressure diagnosis. On September 13, 1982, Grace and her 17-year-old daughter Stephanie were driving from their country home in Rock Argle down to Monaco. They were heading to the train station so Stephanie could catch a train to Paris to start school. Grace had an 11-year-old Rover filled with dresses and luggage. Her chauffeur offered to drive, but Grace insisted she could handle it. They couldn't fit 3 people with all the belongings in the car. The road from Rock Argle winds down the mountainside with steep curves. About 2 miles from La Turbie, there's an especially sharp bend where drivers have to brake hard and steer carefully through a 150-degree turn to the right. Grace's car never made that turn. What Stephanie told her sister Caroline after the accident painted a terrifying picture. Grace kept saying the brakes didn't work. She was in complete panic. Stephanie grabbed the handbrake and pulled, but the car wouldn't stop. It just kept accelerating. A witness following behind saw the Rover swerve violently, zigzagging across both lanes. Then the car straightened out and shot forward at high speed. He knew the curve was coming and realised what was about to happen. There were no brake lights. The car smashed through the retaining wall and somersaulted 120 feet down the cliff, crashing through tree branches and slamming into the slope. When rescuers reached the wreckage, Stephanie was conscious but trapped. She had to escape through the driver's side window because the passenger door was completely smashed in. This detail would later fuel false rumours that Stephanie had been driving, not Grace. Grace was unconscious when they pulled her from the car. She was taken to Princess Grace Hospital, ironically named after her. The palace initially released statements saying she was stable with broken bones. Her brother in Philadelphia was told she was out of danger. But the truth was far worse. Grace had suffered 2 brain hemorrhages. One was caused by the impact. The other had happened before the crash. Doctors believe Grace had a stroke while driving. That's why she couldn't brake. She wasn't confused or mixing up pedals. Her body simply stopped responding. She never regained consciousness. On September 14, 1982, Prince Rainier and his children, Caroline and Albert, made the decision to remove Grace from life support. She was 52 years old. Stephanie was still in the hospital recovering from a fractured vertebra in her neck. She wasn't told her mother had died until 2 days after the crash. She couldn't attend the funeral. Nearly 100 million people around the world watched as Prince Rainier, shattered with grief, walked with Caroline and Albert to lay Grace to rest in the same cathedral where they'd been married. The questions began immediately. Why was Grace driving when she hated to drive and had a chauffeur? Following a car crash in Monaco in the 1970s, she'd reportedly sworn off driving forever. Yet, on this particular day, she dismissed her chauffeur because of the luggage and dresses filling the back seat. Why were there no skid marks on the road? Police examined the scene thoroughly and found none, which suggested the brakes had never been applied. Why was the gear in park when the car was found? Stephanie later explained that she knew from preparing for her driving test that you had to put the car in park to stop it, so she'd tried to shift it. The hospital's handling of the case raised questions too. Princess Grace Hospital, ironically named after Grace herself, didn't have a CT scanner. Grace had been given anesthesia early on, which meant she couldn't be moved immediately for proper scanning. It wasn't until later in the day that she was transported to a smaller private clinic in Monaco that did have scanning equipment. By then, the cerebral hemorrhaging was clearly visible. Some wondered if an earlier scan might have made a difference, though doctors insisted the timing was appropriate. The palace's communication to the public made matters worse. Initially, official statements described Grace as stable with broken bones. Her brother John Kelly in Philadelphia was told she was out of danger. The hospital's chief surgeon later called these palace communiques garbage when speaking to the New York Times. The misleading information led to shock when Grace's death was announced, because the public had been led to believe she would recover. Some claimed Grace must have been distracted or arguing with Stephanie. Others whispered about more sinister possibilities. There were even wild theories about the mafia putting a hit on her, though Prince Rainier dismissed this as absurd. But the most common explanation became simply that the curse had claimed another victim. Grace Kelly, one of the most beautiful and talented women of her generation, had become Princess of Monaco. And she died tragically, just like the curse foretold. The tragedy devastated Prince Rainier. He never remarried. For 23 years, until his own death in 2005, he ruled Monaco as a widower. His children, meanwhile, would discover that their own paths to happiness in love would be just as difficult as the curse predicted. Caroline's 3 marriages and unbearable loss. Princess Caroline had always been in the spotlight. Born 9 months after Grace and Rainier's wedding, she was the centre of attention from her first breath. Beautiful, intelligent, and poised, Caroline seemed destined for a brilliant life. But her journey through marriage would prove the curse wasn't just a story. In 1978, at age 21, Caroline married Philippe Junot. He was 17 years older than her, a French businessman known for his playboy lifestyle. The wedding was glamorous, but the marriage lasted only 2 years. The couple divorced in 1980. It was the first sign that Caroline's path wouldn't be as smooth as it appeared. In 1983, Caroline married Stefano Casiraghi, a handsome Italian businessman 3 years younger than her. This marriage felt different. Stefano was warm, funny, and devoted. He came from a wealthy Italian family. His father, Giancarlo Casiraghi, had built a fortune in heating and air conditioning equipment. Stefano had grown up at Villa Cigogne, the family estate in Fino Mornasco, Italy. He'd attended Milan's Bocconi University alongside his brothers, but left without obtaining a degree to join the family's real estate and retail export businesses. By the time he met Caroline, he was running successful construction companies and had been appointed chairman of Cogefar France, a construction subsidiary of Fiat. At the time of his first child's birth, he was also directing the Christian Dior boutique in Monte Carlo. Caroline was already 3 months pregnant when they married in a civil ceremony. They couldn't have a Catholic ceremony because her first marriage hadn't been annulled yet. Caroline and Stefano had 3 children together. Andrea was born in 1984, Charlotte in 1986, and Pierre in 1987. The family settled into a relatively quiet life, avoiding the constant media circus that had followed Caroline in her youth. Stefano had a passion for offshore powerboat racing, and he was good at it. Very good. He won 12 races out of 80 competitions and became the world champion in 1989. On October 3, 1990, Stefano was defending his world offshore title in a race off the coast of Monaco near Cap Ferrat. The day before, he'd stopped to help rescue the crew of a competing boat that had caught fire. Now, During the second leg of the championship race, his boat was in first place. Stefano's co-pilot, Patrice Innocenti, was at the helm. Their catamaran was travelling at approximately 100 miles per hour when it hit a large wave head-on. The 42-foot boat flipped violently. Innocenti was thrown clear and pulled from the water with minor injuries. But Stefano remained strapped in his seat. The force of the boat slamming back into the water killed him instantly. He was 30 years old. Caroline was in Paris when she received the news. She rushed back to Monaco, arriving in black mourning clothes. 8 years after Princess Grace's funeral in Monaco's Cathedral of St. Nicholas, the royal family gathered in the same place to bury Stefano. Caroline had to tell her 3 children that their father was never coming home. Andrea was 6, Charlotte was 4, and Pierre was 3. Some of Stefano's friends believed his death wasn't just an accident. They pointed to a series of disturbing incidents. A week before he died, Stefano had confided to a close friend that he'd received death threats. He said he was frightened and felt someone was trying to kill him. In 1986, a boat he was supposed to pilot had mysteriously exploded, nearly killing his co-pilot. The same co-pilot, Patrice Innocenti, was with him when he died. Months before that explosion, someone had run Stefano off the road. He was convinced it was deliberate. He'd also pulled out of a resort project after enemies bombed 2 of his restaurants. Whether Stefano's death was truly an accident or something more sinister, the result was the same. Caroline was a widow at 33 with 3 young children. Her mother had died in a car crash 8 years earlier. Now her husband was gone too. In 1999, Caroline married for a 3rd time. Prince Ernst August of Hanover was the head of the House of Hanover, a noble family that had lost its throne in 1866. They had 1 daughter together, Princess Alexandra, but this marriage too would face difficulties. By 2009, the couple had reportedly separated, though they never formally divorced. Caroline has essentially lived separately from Ernst August for years. Princess Caroline's romantic life reads like a chronicle of the curse itself. A first marriage that ended in divorce, a second marriage that ended with her beloved husband's violent death, a third marriage that ended in separation. Through it all, she's maintained her dignity and devoted herself to her children and royal duties. But happiness in marriage has eluded her, exactly as the legend foretold. Stephanie's wild path and heartbreak. Princess Stephanie was only 17 when she watched her mother die. She was in the passenger seat of that rover, helpless as Grace lost consciousness and the car plunged off the cliff. For years afterward, Stephanie felt the weight of guilt and suspicion. People couldn't accept that Grace Kelly, the perfect princess, could have a stroke and crash. They needed someone to blame. Rumours spread that Stephanie had actually been driving, even though multiple witnesses saw Grace behind the wheel and the police confirmed it. The fact that Stephanie had to escape through the driver's side window because the passenger door was destroyed gave fuel to those false stories. She carried the burden of being blamed for her mother's death on top of the trauma of experiencing it. In an interview years later, Stephanie described how people created a narrative where she must have caused the accident because her mother was too perfect. She said, "You can't help feeling guilty when enough people say it." The psychological damage was immense. Perhaps because of this trauma, Stephanie's life took a different path from her sister's. Where Caroline maintained a royal propriety, Stephanie rebelled. She dated celebrities and moved through relationships that kept tabloids busy. She became a pop singer, releasing albums that critics dismissed but that sold well. She modelled. She opened a boutique. She seemed determined to live life on her own terms. In 1995, Stephanie married her bodyguard, Daniel Ducrouet. They already had 2 children together, Louis and Pauline. The marriage lasted exactly 1 year before they divorced in 1996. Then, in 1998, Stephanie had a 3rd child, Camille Gottlieb. She didn't identify the father on the birth certificate and only revealed later that he was Jean Raymond Gottlieb, the head of her security. They never married. Stephanie dated Frank O'Neill, a married elephant trainer, and lived in his circus caravan with her 3 children. The relationship eventually ended. In 2003, she married Portuguese acrobat Adans Lopes Perez. That marriage lasted 10 months before divorce. Through all of this, Stephanie has been a devoted mother to her 3 children. She's done extensive charity work focused on fighting AIDS and helping people struggling with homelessness. But in terms of lasting happiness in marriage, 2 brief marriages ended in divorce: Albert's Playboy years and The Reluctant Bride. For decades, Prince Albert was known as Europe's most eligible bachelor. Born in 1958, he became the heir to Monaco's throne when his father, Rainier, died in 2005. But before he took the throne at age 47, Albert had earned a reputation as a playboy. He'd been linked to supermodels including Claudia Schiffer and Naomi Campbell. Actress Brooke Shields dated him. Pop star Kylie Minogue was rumoured to have had a romance with him. The list of women connected to Prince Albert filled magazines for years, but none of those relationships led to marriage, and Monaco needed an heir. There was a complication. Albert had children, but they were born outside of marriage. In 2005, he acknowledged that he was the father of Alexandra Coste, a boy born in 2003 to Nicole Coste, a former flight attendant from Togo. They'd met when Albert was a passenger on one of her flights. The relationship had been secret, but when Nicole became pregnant, Albert agreed to acknowledge the child after a DNA test proved paternity. He'd also fathered a daughter, Yasmin Grace Grimaldi, born in 1992 to Tamara Rotolo, an American woman. Because both children were born outside of marriage, neither could inherit the throne or hold royal titles. Monaco's constitution required legitimate heirs. Albert met Charlene Whitstock, a South African Olympic swimmer, in 2000 at a swimming competition in Monaco. Charlene had been born in Bulawayo, Rhodesia in 1978 and moved to South Africa when she was 12. She'd become a champion swimmer, representing South Africa at the 2000 Sydney Olympics, where her team finished 5th in the 4x100-metre medley relay. She won medals at the Commonwealth Games and All Africa Games. When she met Albert at the Mare Nostrum swimming meet, she was 22 and he was 42. They spent hours talking and laughing together, and Charlene later said she felt an instant connection, but they didn't immediately become a couple. They made their first public appearance together at the 2006 Winter Olympics in Turin, 6 years after they'd met. After a 5-year relationship, Albert proposed in 2010 with a ring featuring a pear-shaped 3-carat diamond surrounded by diamond brilliance, created by Parisian jeweller Repossi. Charlene, who'd been raised Protestant, converted to Catholicism for the wedding, even though it wasn't required by Monaco's constitution. She took French lessons and studied the Monegasque dialect. She learned European court protocol. The wedding was scheduled for July 2011, and Monaco prepared for celebrations that would cost an estimated $55 million to $68 million spread over 3 days. Then, just days before the wedding, disturbing reports began to surface. French magazine L'Express reported that Charlene had tried to flee Monaco. According to the report, she'd been stopped at the Nice airport with a one-way ticket to South Africa. Palace officials had allegedly confiscated her passport and persuaded her to return. The reason? Rumours spread that a Brazilian woman had given birth to or was pregnant with Albert's 3rd love child, and this child may have been conceived during Albert's relationship with Charlene. The thought that her fiancé had cheated on her during their 5 years together was said to have devastated her. Palace officials denied everything, calling the stories ugly rumours born of jealousy. But the reports wouldn't die. On July 1, 2011, Charlene and Albert went through with the civil ceremony. Charlene wore a blue Chanel jacket and pants. She appeared uncomfortable, her eyes red. The ceremony was conducted by Philippe Narmino, Director of Judicial Services and President of the Council of State, in the throne room of the Prince's palace. The couple signed the marriage register with a specially created Mont Blanc pen made of gold and precious stones, adorned with their cipher. After the civil ceremony, Charlene officially became Her Serene Highness the Princess of Monaco. The 20-minute ceremony was attended by Caroline and Stephanie, as well as Charlene's parents and brothers. The next day was the religious ceremony in the courtyard of the Prince's palace. Charlene wore a stunning Armani gown with a train that required assistants to manage. The guest list read like a who's who of European royalty and international celebrities. Prince Albert's sisters, Caroline and Stephanie, were there with their families. Guests included Giorgio Armani, Karl Lagerfeld, and Naomi Campbell. Roger Moore attended. The Crown Prince and Crown Princess of Norway represented their country. The Prince of Orange and Princess Maxima represented the Netherlands. Hereditary princes and princesses from across Europe filled the courtyard. Part of the ceremony was conducted in Afrikaans, Charlene's native language from South Africa. Archbishop Bernard Barcy presided over the religious blessing. But throughout the ceremony, she was visibly crying. These were not tears of joy. When Albert moved to kiss her, she appeared to recoil slightly. The moment was caught on camera and replayed around the world. The body language between them looked strained. Later, when Albert gave a speech at the wedding reception, he didn't speak of love. Instead, he thanked Charlene for being patient with him, a remarkably tepid statement from a groom on his wedding day. Charlene insisted in later interviews that her tears were tears of happiness. She said it was an emotional day with a lot going on. She claimed she wasn't a runaway bride, but observers at the ceremony said she looked miserable. The Guardian described it as a Brothers Grimm version of a fairy tale. ABC News reported that the bride was in tears throughout the ceremony and that her discomfort was obvious. The honeymoon was equally strange. Albert and Charlene flew to South Africa for the International Olympic Committee meeting in Durban. They stayed at a luxury hotel, but palace officials confirmed that for the first several days, they slept in separate hotels 10 miles apart. Albert stayed in Durban to be close to his meetings. Charlene stayed in Umhlanga Rocks. The official explanation was that he wanted to avoid traffic in the morning. But it struck many as bizarre for newlyweds to spend their honeymoon in different hotels. The speculation became that an arrangement had been reached. Charlene would provide Albert with a legitimate heir, and, in exchange, she'd live a lavish lifestyle and eventually be free to leave once she'd fulfilled her duty. Neither Albert nor Charlene has ever confirmed such an arrangement, but the rumours persist. In December 2014, Charlene gave birth to twins, Prince Jacques and Princess Gabriella. Monaco finally had its heirs. Jacques would be next in line for the throne, but the marriage continued to look troubled. In 2021, Charlene spent months in South Africa, claiming she had a medical issue that prevented her from flying. She was away from her family for an extraordinarily long time. When she returned to Monaco, she reportedly spent time at a treatment facility. Albert and Charlene have remained married, but they've been photographed together mainly at official functions. Whether their marriage is genuinely unhappy or whether they've found a way to make an arrangement work, only they know. But from the outside, it looks like another Grimaldi marriage that hasn't found happiness. Now, Albert's illegitimate children have grown. Yasmin Grace is in her 30s. Alexandra is in his 20s. Both seem to have accepted their positions, the pattern that won't break. Beyond the immediate royal family, the curse extends to other Grimaldis as well. Prince Rainier's sister Antoinette had 3 marriages, all ending in divorce or death. Her first marriage to Alexandre Athénase Noguès lasted only 4 years. Her second marriage to Dr. Jean-Charles Ray lasted 10 years before divorce. Her final marriage to dancer John Brian Gilpin ended when he died suddenly, just 6 weeks after their wedding. Going back further, Claudine, Lady of Monaco in the 1400s, was the sole heir. Her father arranged for her to marry her cousin, Lamberto Grimaldi, to keep the throne in the family. The marriage was described as happy, but their son, Jean II, was murdered in 1505 by his own brother, Lucien. Claudine witnessed one of her sons kill the other. In the 1600s, Louis I of Monaco married Catherine Charlotte de Gramont. But she was known for having many lovers. Despite being married to Louis, Catherine continued her affairs while they lived in Paris, eventually leaving him to become the mistress of King Louis XIV of France. The pattern repeats across 7 centuries. Marriages ending in divorce, spouses dying young, affairs and betrayals, children caught in the crossfire, a family that cannot escape its story. Today, Monaco remains one of the wealthiest places on earth. The Grimaldi family's personal fortune is estimated at over $1 billion. Monaco has become a tax haven for the super-rich, a glamorous destination where luxury yachts crowd the harbour and the casinos never stop running. Prince Albert rules the principality now, continuing a dynasty that has lasted more than 700 years. His children Jacques and Gabriella are being raised to eventually take over. Princess Caroline continues her royal duties. Princess Stephanie has largely stepped back from public life, but still participates in family events. The family maintains that the curse is just a legend, a story that persists because every family has difficulties. They point out that many royal families across Europe have dealt with divorces and tragedies. Why should the Grimaldis be different? But the believers in the curse see the pattern. They count the failed marriages. They remember Grace Kelly's death at 52. They think about Stefano Casiraghi's fatal crash at 30. They watch Charlene at official events. They see Albert's illegitimate children. They note that Caroline is separated and Stephanie divorced twice. The evidence, they say, speaks for itself. Whether the curse is real or whether it's simply a story that colours how people interpret events, the result is the same. The Grimaldi family of Monaco has endured extraordinary wealth and equally extraordinary heartbreak. Their marriages have been plagued by difficulties that money and power couldn't prevent. Their private tragedies have played out on a public stage for the world to watch. The legend says that never will a Grimaldi find happiness in marriage. After 700 years of broken unions, early deaths, and shattered hopes, many people believe that witches' curse from the 14th century still holds power today. What's undeniable is that the Grimaldi family has paid a heavy price for their throne. They rule over one of the most desirable locations on earth. They live in unimaginable luxury, but true happiness in love has remained out of their reach. Generation after generation, the same patterns emerge: divorce, death, separation, scandal. Princess Grace once said in an interview just months before her death that she knew people would eventually ask what she wanted written about her life. She hoped they would say she cared about people and tried to make a difference. She got her wish in terms of her charitable legacy. But her life, and the lives of her children, also became evidence for those who believe some families carry curses that cannot be broken. Monaco sparkles on the Mediterranean, beautiful and wealthy. The Grimaldis rule from their palace on the rock, and the legend of the witch's curse continues, waiting to see what happens to the next generation. Will Prince Jacques and Princess Gabriella finally break the pattern? Or will they discover that being born into the House of Grimaldi means accepting that happiness in marriage may be the one thing their royal blood cannot grant them? If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.